Well, how y'all doing today? Hope y'all having a blessed day. We're getting rain today and it's much needed. I love it. I could live with it for 2 or 3 days. I really could. It has finally cooled off. Yeah, so I'm making this video about my grandmother's haunted house. And yeah, people, that stuff's real. Now, I'm an empath, a haiku, alright? And if you don't know what that means, you can look it up. I'm an introvert extrovert, and this stuff runs in my family. So I want to talk about my grandmother's haunted house. Alright, so when we went to visit my grandmother in Indiana, she was Irish, full-blooded Irish, blonde hair and blue eyes. I was sick. And my grandmother mixed stuff up, we'll put it to you that way. And she'd go out and dig up wild ginger and make cough syrup, put alcohol in it and honey. And that was the only time alcohol was allowed in the house. And my uncles, they would go out into the woods and rob beehives every year to get that honey. And I went up there sick. I was sick, and they gave me a couple tablespoons of it, and they told me you're going to sleep, but when you wake up, you'll feel better. And I did. I slept for almost 8 hours. But when I woke up, I was cured. But the house my grandmother lived in and raised my mother and her 4 sisters and 5 brothers in had a history, all right? And I used to listen to them talk. You know, I was like a fly on the wall. I was that kind of kid. And I used to sit and listen to them talk about when it was going to start again. And I wondered what they were talking about. And when I woke up from the stupor that my grandmother's homemade cough syrup put me in, it was raining. And there was a banging on the side of the house. And there was no trees that close to the house where it could be a branch or something, you know. And that banging started. And I was very young. And I looked at my mom and said, "What is that?" She just grabbed me and held on to me. And that banging got so loud that it was deafening. I mean, that's all you could hear. It was so loud. And I witnessed my grandmother yelling at the top of her lungs, because you had to, because it was that loud. And she yelled at the top of her lungs, "I ain't ever done nothing to nobody, and I surely ain't never done nothing to you," and it stopped. But it went on for a long time. Again, they walked around trying to find out if it was something in the house. They went outside in the rain trying to find out if it was something like a branch or something hitting the house because of the weather, and no. And it was like I was covering my ears. It was that loud. But still, I heard my grandmother say, "I ain't never done nothing to nobody. I sure ain't done nothing to you. Please leave us in peace." Now, the house that my grandmother lived in went back 3 generations in my family. That's a long time, people. How many houses go back 3 generations anymore? The people that originally owned it were Indians. They built it there. Now I'm Cherokee, and I've been up to the Wyoming, and I've tried to trace my ancestry down. And the thing of it is, one of my relatives, when they had the Trail of Tears, hid in a cave. And when it was all over and was safe to come out, she went down among the settlers, and she married somebody by the last name of Fortune. Now, I have a family cemetery, both in West Virginia and Indiana, and my grandmother was in Indiana, and the family cemetery is full of Fortunes, because they took on, Americanized names. And so when I was at the res up in Wyoming, I told the woman the story, what I had been told. I hate to call it a story, because back in the day when you said story, it meant you were telling a lie. And I told her I was trying to find out my heritage. People, I've been to the National Archives. Pardon me. Problem is they do not allow you to make photocopies of nothing. Any information you find, you have to write down by hand. And you're only given an hour. The woman gave me 2 hours. And while I was there, I viewed the Constitution. It was nice. Anyway, the house had been owned by Indians. I'm Cherokee Indian. I'm about 60% Cherokee Indian. Anybody that's ever watched any of my videos where I actually do show my face can tell I'm Indian. So it was a very strange event. It really was. Now, the first supernatural event, and being an empath, I mean, I could just sense things left and right. Nobody has to tell me anything, I sense it. The first supernatural experience I ever had was in Louisiana. When I moved to Lake Charles, Louisiana with my son, he was about 10. We lived in a house. We rented a room until I could get established, get a job, and get a place of my own, which I did. I could be laying there sleeping, and I would be shoved. That's the only way I can put it. I would be shoved. I'd be laying on my side, and I'd be shoved over onto my stomach. You let that resonate. It happened so many times. I thought I was losing my mind. And then I decided I'm just going to lay here and close my eyes. I'm not going to go to sleep. I'm not even going to try to go to sleep. I'm going to lay here and close my eyes. See what happens. And it still happened. I mean, I could feel that hand on my back shoving me. Shoving me to the point where I was laying on my stomach. I mean, it rolled me over. And I went to the person that I was renting the room from. I rented a room for myself and my son. He had his own room. I said, can you tell me the history of this house? You know anything about the history of this house? And he was a sheriff in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and he asked me why, and I said, because I'm experiencing something. Of course, he thought I was crazy, and I said, well, I would just like to know the history of the house. And he said, well, the house next door, which I actually looked into buying the house next door, a nice little house, and it was empty. It had been empty for a long time, from what I was told, years. I said, what's going on with that house? And he said, what's the house next door? Oh, he was avoiding the issue. Well, the house next door had been lived in by 2 brothers that inherited from their parents, and one brother had killed the other over a peanut butter sandwich. Let that resonate. And so the brother that had killed his brother over that sandwich went to jail for life, and that house sat there empty. But I was experiencing this, and I said to him, please, do you know anything about this house? Is there a history of it? And he said, yeah, there is. I said, what is it? He said there was a man that lived here, and his girlfriend left him for another man, and he put a shotgun in his mouth and blew his head off. Well, people that escalated me wanting to get out of there real quick, and I did. Got my own place as soon as I could. But my grandmother's house, mm-mm. Had heard them talk about it. The noise, how loud it'd get. It sounded like somebody was driving a semi-truck through the side of that house. Both of my grandparents had died there. Great-grandparents had died there of cancer. Embalmed them right in the house. Back in the day, you did that. And they actually dumped the blood right outside the window. And my mother said grass would not grow there anymore. Where they had dumped the blood, the grass would not grow there any longer. And I witnessed this. I witnessed, it sounded like something beating up against the side of that house. And it got so loud it was deafening. And my grandmother yelled at the top of her lungs, "I ain't never done nothing to nobody. I surely ain't done nothing to you," when it stopped. It came back again after that, but that day it stopped. My family goes back several generations in Indiana, Grandview. My grandfather sat on the city council. I have a family cemetery, Friendship Cemetery, there in Indiana. And everybody in that cemetery is a relative of mine, and I even have Potters. Last name Potter. And I've walked that cemetery. And when I went back and I couldn't find my grandfather's grave. Now, my great-grandfather, he died of TB. This cemetery is along the banks of the Ohio River. And he used to go there and work the farms. And they had bunkhouses, and he'd go and he'd stay for a week or 2 or 3 and work. And he'd come down with TB. Back then they didn't have a cure for TB. There was no inoculation against it. And they would say that it was caused by cold air. That shouldn't be strange, people, because in England they had what they called bed curtains. And it went all around your bed and was to keep the cold air out, because people believed then that a lot of diseases and the reason people died and came down with stuff was because of the cold air at night. If you watch, what's the name of that? With Ebenezer Scrooge, he had bed curtains. And the purpose of them bed curtains was to keep the night air out, because a lot of people thought that the night air was what caused people to come down sick and die. You know, there's some truth in that, people, because if you're sick, you will find that at night your cold gets worse. So he died of TB, and they believed that it was caused by the night air in them bunkhouses. And after a while, she had children and everything, and after a while she remarried. Somebody from the church that she went to married her. And my mother always spoke highly of him. Back then, that was a regular practice, that if a woman with children became widowed and she was a good woman, somebody out of the church would marry her. And they always spoke highly of him. Raised him like they were his own. But I witnessed that. I witnessed the sound. It sounded like somebody was about to drive a semi-truck through the side of the house. And there was no trees that would bang it up against the house. And it would get so loud it was deafening. That's why my grandmother yelled at the top of her lungs, I've never done nothing to nobody. I surely haven't done anything to you. Now, and it stopped. Now, after she passed away, they sold the house. They still have the property is still in my family. Belongs to a nephew or something, a cousin, I should say. They sold the house, and they my grandmother she wallpapered religiously, and it had siding on the outside of it. But when they sold it, they stripped it down and moved it to a lake. And when they did, it was a log cabin. It was a log cabin that had been built by Indians, Cherokee Indians. Out back, there was a big old ditch, and it had been a road at one time. And there was caves all through there. I wanted to go, but my mother would never take me. But as kids, my grandmother and my mother and her brothers would go and play in that cave. There was caves all through there, and they'd go and play in the cave, and there was all kinds of artifacts in that cave. And I wanted her to take me. I desperately wanted her to take me, and she would not. She just didn't want to do it. Now, I've mentioned this in another video. I may have mentioned it in this one already. My grandmother would mix stuff up. She'd go out in the woods and dig up wild ginger and make her own cough syrup and everything. And when somebody would come down sick, they'd come and get her, because she was known for having home remedies. And on one occasion, houses weren't that close then, and back then when my mom was small, young or whatever, they had what was called a buckboard, and they'd take the buckboard and saddle it up to a horse and take it into town when they had to go into town. But there was oddly enough, there was a store there that my grandmother would tell my grandfather that the kids were not allowed in that store. If you have to go into that store, you leave the kids out in the wagon. Yeah, I'm that close to a wagon, people, generationally, because it had a parrot in there, all right? And that guy had taught the parrot to cuss, so my grandmother wouldn't allow the kids in there. Anyway, when my grandmother passed away, they eventually sold the house, and they stripped it back down to its original state. And it had been a log cabin, like I said, that was built by Cherokee Indians. I would miss that house. Last time I was there, my uncle wanted to take me to see the property. The house was gone. He said, "I'll even take you to where the house is." They were all born in that house. I said, "No, that's all right." But when it was like a mile up from the Ohio River. Actually, Abraham Lincoln had worked just within 5 miles from there at a post office. Just across the bridge from Kentucky, which I lived in Kentucky, Owensboro, Kentucky. I lived in a couple places in Kentucky, a beautiful place. Growing up, I lived there. It's God's country for sure, but that has been my experience with the macabre, the supernatural. And I can't explain it, I really can't. I can't explain what happened at my grandmother's house. Can't explain what happened at the place I stayed in Louisiana. It was scary at the time, really scary at the time. As a child at my grandmother's, as an adult in Louisiana. But I'm glad I did experience it. So I'm no stranger to the macabre and to the unusual. And if anybody ever asked me, is it real? I'd have to say yes, because I've experienced it firsthand. So I thought I'd put that out there, document this, at least for my grandkids. It exists, people. It really does. Y'all have a blessed day. Bye-bye.